Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Scott Luton here with you on Supply Chain Now. Welcome to today's program. First off, our entire team hopes this afternoon finds you safe and sound. We had almost right at 500 professionals from around the world register for today's Stand Up and Sound Off. And our most sincere best wishes go out to each of you and your families during these challenging times. But today, our aim is to facilitate really an information sharing and industry intel gathering session. We've moved our efforts really into overdrive here at Supply Chain Now, as our audience clearly needs good information, insights, and thought leadership, especially given what we're facing here. And that's exactly what we hope to do today. So this Stand Up and Sound Off program is a good bit different than the rest of our programming. We want to make it this one to be one of our most interactive sessions ever. And as our focus truly is on the audience and your observations and comments and questions. As the environment around us has evolved dramatically, since we first scheduled this session several months back, we wanted to ensure that our audience was engaged by a variety of expert views. So in addition to my good friend and colleague and co-host Greg White, we've bolstered our event today with several business leaders that will share info, prompt your thoughts, and take your questions and comments and really ask you some questions. That's what we're after. So welcome to each of our panelists, each of our attendees, each and every one of you. And of course, we should say big thanks to the team over at EFT by Reuters Events for helping us make this program take place, helping us get the word out of this information sharing opportunity. So big thanks to Nick and to Jamie and the whole team over there. And if you hadn't checked out their dynamic organization, you can do so at EFT.com. Okay, so if you've attended any of our webinars going back, 5 or 6 years, we've got some ground rules. These are this type of event where we're trying to facilitate as much information from all the participants as we can. We got to put some guideposts here. So let's walk through these really quick before we dive in. So please bear with us here today. These types of virtual events can be really tricky. We're going to be doing our best to engage the audience as effectively as we can today, as well as share information. And we want to hear from each and every one of you, but unfortunately, that's probably not going to be possible in 90 minutes, but we're going to reach as many of you as we can. Secondly, we want to ensure that we have an effective, orderly conversation, so all of our attendees are going to be on mute. But with that said, we want to hear from you. Your questions, insights, observations, you can do that in one of two ways. The easiest is using the GoToWebinar text box where you can submit a comment or submit a question or what have you. And if you have a steady internet connection, and only if you have a solid PC microphone, you can also use the raise your hand option, and we'll attempt to recognize you, unmute your mic at that point, and allow you to engage verbally. So please, as you might imagine, we want to avoid politics and sales pitches, right? And finally, a recording and PDF of this session will be available to all registrants in the next day or two. Okay, already ahead of schedule. We love that. So let's dive right in. I want to welcome in Greg White to the discussion. Greg serves as my regular co-host on Supply Chain Now and as a partner in the business. He's a supply chain technology entrepreneur and trusted advisor to many businesses. Greg, welcome.
Hey, Scott, thank you. It's great to be here, of course, and glad to see all the hard work that we've put into this has pulled some people in to get some valuable information on a challenging topic.
Absolutely, and I know that that there's so many developments that it's really important to track and share. But I know you've pulled a few that you'd want to share and maybe get some feedback from the audience on.
Yeah, I have. We've had a lot of discussions with some of our panelists here in just the last few weeks on these topics, and we've had a lot of discussions about some of these things over time. So let me go through these 3 points one at a time. There were many, many more things that because of our discussions we could have gone into, but we've also got other panelists who are going to share their thoughts. And as Scott said earlier, it's important that we hear from you all in the audience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of these mean, and then we'll open it up for discussion and conversation and questions from the audience. So this is a question that I've seen posed pretty frequently, and that is, because of what's going on with COVID-19 and the inevitable and totally necessary global recognition of the disruption risk that this has created, does this mean a change to how we plan and manage inventory? And we've had a lot of discussions around this. There are a lot of people who think forecasting could be better to predict these things, that responsiveness of technology or of solutions needs to be more timely, that technology is a solution to this, where so many companies are still using spreadsheets and manual processes and all of those sorts of things. So, and there are a slew of other points that are brought up by this. But the point of this question, is, in the many ways that it's been asked, is, do we need to start looking at how we manage differently because of this disruption risk, and I think what people perceive as the significant chance of further disruption in the future? And the short answer is yes, of course we need to look at changes, some foundational, some incremental, and some transformational, depending on where your business stands right now. So let me kind of take these in a couple different veins and attack these veins sort of one by one. So the question around forecasting and what could forecasting do? We did an article last week and it had sort of a subtopic, a spirited discussion around forecasting and whether forecasting could predict something like this event. And the truth is, the way that forecasting works, typically historical methods of forecasting don't equip themselves very well to do that, because regardless of the advancement of the technique, the incredible math or algorithms that are used, they are really an extrapolation of the past to tell us what is going to happen in the future. And that has long burdened supply chain, and particularly burdens it in the instance of a disruption like this. There are other ways to attack forecasting, and one is to, one of the newest ways of doing that is something that I have been advocating for a few years, and that is to forecast the influencers, not of the products, right? We don't want to predict toilet paper, because in case everybody in the world hasn't noticed, toilet paper doesn't move until somebody yanks it off the shelf, or in this case, everyone yanks it off the shelf. But we don't want to predict items, we want to predict the consumer's actions. And in order to do that, we need to analyze the influences on the consumer that make them take these actions. Toilet paper is a great example, because that was a panic purchase, and we've heard a lot about panic buying. Why did I buy a pack of toilet paper? Because I saw a guy grab 4 packs of toilet paper, and I thought, wow, I better get that before it all runs out. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So forecasting in and of itself would have a very difficult time predicting such a thing. However, with the capabilities that we've got, with advanced algorithms, and even, I think more importantly, artificial intelligence, the ability to capture a run being everyone kind of going after the same product, the ability to capture a run on a product and to learn from that very rapidly, and to start the response mechanism in a supply chain technology exists. And there are ways being developed and in some places deployed that can start to attack that. And that leads into what I think is perhaps a more important aspect of this than even trying to fine-tune the forecasting, and that is the responsiveness of a solution. So the first thing that you learn if you've been in supply chain school is that, any kind of supply chain education, is that the first thing that happens with the forecast is that it is proven wrong in some measure, right? It's wrong by a little bit, or it's wrong by a lot, but it's wrong. It's too high, it's too low, it's predicting stability when you have instability, all of that technical stuff aside, it's wrong. And so you need to have integrated into your solution the ability to be very, very responsive, because we can't always and can't 100% predict how demand is going to occur. So that responsiveness in solutions is what's very, very important as well. And we need to have solutions that are able to tackle the constraints and the requirements of the supply chain. I only order on Monday, or I have to fill a truckload, or this comes in pallets, things like that. Those can be and should be automated, and those expedite the responsiveness. Also, solutions that are service level or customer experience driven can start to detect when customer experience or your fill rate is at risk and preempt those stockouts in normal and even in some exceptional circumstances. But in any case, they create that rapidity of responsiveness. And then the last is really, I think these are the things that we need to look at very carefully. And this is not anymore a competitive advantage issue. This is a survival issue, in my opinion, at this point. And that is, in order to do those things, to be able to forecast better and to forecast the customers and the influences on the customers and to respond rapidly, you need to undertake a technology transformation and do so soon. If you think that your personal knowledge, and I've been there, I've been a forecaster, I've been a planner, I've been a store manager, I've been a district manager, and I have been one of those people who has said, I know my business better than any computer ever could, and I was right for about 3 items. But aside from that, technology has no emotion, it never misses work, it doesn't get COVID-19, it never forgets that input that caused it to have that learning before. There is no memory loss in a technology. So technology becomes a very, very critical survival and thrival mechanism for companies. So if we address foundationally those 3 aspects, those to me are the big changes that we need to address in order to reduce disruption risk. Let me shift to a little bit of a topic that we've heard a lot about too, and we'll come back to these for questions. So keep your thoughts or share them with Scott, and we'll come back and air your questions real quickly. So the other thing is that, and this is something I've heard recently, is the conflicting effect of social distancing efforts. For instance, at Costco, they were only letting in a certain number of people so as not to crowd the store. Well, at the front of the store and the back of the store, at the entry to the store and at the registers of the store, people were crowded very closely together. Some other efforts here in the States with many groceries and other stores, they're allowing seniors in for 1 hour prior to the regular hours of the store, so they get first opportunity at goods, and so that they aren't crowded by younger, more aggressive, whatever type shoppers. The issue that creates, as you can imagine, is that, for instance, in a grocery near my house, every single shopping cart was used, which never happens, by the way, during opening hours of virtually any grocery store I've ever been to. And all of those people in that very high risk group were crowded together at the entrance in the store and throughout the store. So we have to think about those things. And the good news is here that governments are starting to think about the impact of social distancing. I have to say that I think Spain has done an excellent job. They have marks on the floor that keep, in some groceries anyway, that keep people a certain distance from one another. They know how many of those marks they have, and they don't put more people in a store than those marks
Greg,
can separate.
We've gotten a couple of quick comments here. The first one goes back to your first bullet point that I'm going to pose to you, and pose to you and the audience from Jeff in just a second. But Michael makes a good point. Michael says, quote, let's agree to use physical distancing instead of social distancing, because that is what it really is. I trust if we rather get closer socially, even if only virtually for quite some time, I think things will be better off. So great point, Michael. I've seen that physical distancing messaging start to hopefully take root. Great point. So
that's a really good point. Words matter, right?
Absolutely.
And
Great.
we have to use words carefully.
Right.
So that's a really good point.
Here's a question, Greg, for you, and a question for the audience. This comes from Jeff, and this goes back to your first bullet point. Jeff says, this is not the best time to implement a major technology shift. What do you suggest for changes that can be made now?
Well, what I would suggest is understand the capabilities that your technology today has. I've seen a few technology companies taking a really, really active stance in saying, if you're experiencing out of stocks, here's how you can manage that. You can utilize the technology that you have today doing that. I would suggest that you reach out to your technology provider or whoever is the subject matter expert or analyst on your technology and learn about those things. Share your problem. Share the problem that you have, not the solution that you want. This is an important part of any kind of analysis. Is we as users have to always share the problem and the goal that we seek, not the action that we want the system to take. That can very quickly cause the system to only address that one situation. So you want to address it very carefully, and I'll repeat that again. This is the problem that we have. This is the result that we would like, not the technique that we expect the technology to take. And I think that alone, regardless of what your technology, will help you address those things. You'll learn very quickly whether your technology does or could attack that issue. Sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, great. Excellent question, Jeff. Appreciate the perspective, Greg. To our audience, again, you can, and we knew the questions would start to pour in and comments would pour in, so we're gonna navigate through this and facilitate as best we can. Again, you can use the text toolbar to submit your comments or your question, and you can also use your raise your hand icon, and we'll attempt to connect with you audibly. Sandra, certainly a familiar person on many of our programs and webinars. Great to have Sandra chime in. Sandra agrees with some of your earlier points, Greg. She says, quote, no forecast could have prevented an event similar to what we experienced with Fukushima, volcanoes. None are equivalent to what we are seeing in APAC and in the EU areas. Our responsive mechanisms we must act upon now are accurate priorities. But which ones? Consumer priorities. The problem right now, she says, is COVID-19 brings along uncertainty both for supply and demand as consumer confidence drops due to higher risks globally. So point of sale data becomes 100% critical. So would welcome you to weigh in on that, Greg, or certainly anyone in our audience.
Just waiting a sec to see if somebody wants to weigh in, but I would say to that point, point of sale data is of value. The issue that point of sale data has is that it's not descriptive enough, but it is often the data that we have. And here's this is the argument I would make is we are already talking about, and I'm already seeing articles about the fact that at the end of this, we will, retailers will be overstocked. So what is my question to that, right? Because in times of emergency, you do unnatural things, and they cause unintended consequences at the end. But you have to focus on the emergency now, and you have to focus on fulfilling needs now and worry about solving the optimization problems later. A little bit about like what Jeff said is, hey, we can't change technology. We can't try to optimize and manage an emergency, right? We have to manage this emergency, accept the fact that it will create inefficiencies, overstocks, misplaced inventory and whatnot, misplaced assets, vehicles, and all sorts of things in the supply chain, and then worry about how to handle that later.
Yep. So the comments and questions are coming in. I'm gonna read some of these here. We knew this was going to be the case. Lots of passion in our community here. So Adam shares that our manufacturing and retail clients working across Europe, that is, hardly have the available manpower or organization to manage the day job, let alone manage the crisis, let alone start to think now about how to do different as it relates to inventory planning. Excellent comments there, Adam. Steve, of course, makes a great comment here. No forecast can even predict what happens on a normal day. Great comment, Steve.
Yeah.
And let's see, I want to share one more here. And this is related to the point of sale data from our friend Peter. Point of sale data may have value, but you have to understand it can be misleading under these conditions. Good point.
Yeah, it is undoubtedly misleading, and I think that was some of the point that Sandra was making, is that while that's as valuable and as good of the data as we've got, it doesn't tell the whole story. And that's why, and again, I don't want a future cast here, right? Because it's not meaningful right now. But there is the capability, and as Adam said, we can't solve a problem for tomorrow while we're in the thick of it today, but we can. And I would encourage people, as you go through these challenges, write down, even if it's just a bullet point, write down what that challenge was and what you think the cause was, and again, what you would like not the resolution definition to be, but what you would like to have happened there. And then we can come back and revisit those things after the fact. And I've dealt with so many emergencies in practice, recessions and 9/11 and various things, that if you have somebody able to capture some of these issues and understand why they happened, then that becomes valuable information for prioritizing the changes that you will need to make in the future. Yep. One of my great concerns is that we will overreact to this, and I already see a lot of this on various articles online and LinkedIn, is we need to foundationally change, and that's sort of the first question here. We need to foundationally change how we view risk management. And I would argue that we don't need to foundationally change it. We need to incrementally change it based on what we've learned here. We might need to change the type of data inputs that we get or take or require, and we might need to change the technology or the algorithms or the intelligence that we use to analyze those things, but we don't need to foundationally change these things. One of the companies that's being very successful is Baxter, because they had provision for hurricanes, but that was really a central and emergency inventory process or cache by a company that has 12% net margins. And most of the companies that we're talking to here don't even have 12% gross margins. So the ability for them to carry excess inventory is much, much greater. The ability of most distribution and retail and even most manufacturing companies, it is not to hoard or stock that kind of backup inventory. So we need to be very, very careful and diligent about maintaining the sustainability of those companies while they provision for some ability to offset this kind of demand surge.
So, and we're approaching kind of the end of this first segment, and folks trying to get as many comments as we can. This comes from Fernando Gregg. He agrees this is the time to fully understand the need to digitize our processes. Months ago, I was pushing for our global company to provide our largest customer with express releases, electronic transmission of the bills of lading, and kept being denied. Last Sunday, finally got approved, which was prompted by the emergency, the environment. Of course, what was approved may not apply to all transactions, but at least for their largest customer, it does apply. Any comments there, Greg?
Unfortunately, that's the way business works a lot of times, is, what becomes a priority is what becomes an emergency. And we'd all love to avoid that. And I think that coming out of this, much like coming out of the Great Recession in the States, people change their viewpoint on certain things. I think people will start to change their viewpoint on technology and digital transformation. I believe that will happen. But before we wrap this, Scott,
Yep.
I have to share this. The biggest thing that we have to do as a world, certainly as a country in the United States, but I think as a world, is we have to reduce our dependency on a single source, especially if that source is China, because they have the largest workforce on the planet, 806 million people in their workforce. It's hard to duplicate that workforce with the cumulative workforces of all of the nations in the world. So what we need to, in order to mitigate that risk, many countries need to reshore manufacturing, and they need to do so with robotics. And I will argue that doing so with robotics in this time will not cost us jobs. It will actually create jobs, because the great generation of manual labor is leaving the workforce at 10,000 a day. And in order for us to be able to keep up with a workforce the size of China, we have, and to do so economically feasibly, we have to do it using technology and robotics. I'll put that out there and let anyone argue that however they want, but I feel very, very strongly that if there is any one single risk mitigation tactic of strategy that we need to undertake, it is reshoring and diversification of sourcing.
Okay, excellent. And thanks for all the comments, Greg. Appreciate your perspective. I want to share a couple of these comments before we move into the next segment. Terry says, for those seeing outlier demand, remember when the outbreak subsides, there will be a slump in demand. Make sure that you don't overproduce and incur extra costs that will have to be offset by future lower orders. Business continuity is highest priority. Great points there, Terry.
Yeah.
We've got our first hand raised in the audience, and hey, we're going to roll the dice on this raise your hand.
All right.
So let's see who it was here. It appears to be, well, it just as I click on it, it goes away. So raise your hand is an opportunity. So y'all feel free to use that function if you've got a good connection. Also, Max says, instead of focusing on inventory, businesses could also focus on lean manufacturing, delayed differentiation, and alternate manufacturing processes to deal with spikes. There's, if great comment, Max. But counter to that, there's a couple great articles running around where folks are really looking at lean in terms of how grocery stores have stocked food. I don't want to kick off an argument because it's all about how you apply it. But great comment there, Max. And then one more from Michael. Michael wrote an article on LinkedIn. It's not just hoarding, it's a change in order pattern. So this goes back to your comments earlier, Greg. That includes toilet paper, by the way. What is not used in offices and factories is now used at home. Demand and inventory is being reallocated. Excellent. And then I think this next comment is a good segue into the next segment. And Peter, who spoke earlier, says the only foundational change that has to happen in risk management is to actually do it. Interesting comments there, Peter.
That's a really good comment.
Yes. All right. So now we get to move into big thanks to Greg. Thanks to all the audience members that shared and those I couldn't get to. We're going to move forward here. So next up, I want to welcome another very special guest, David Shillingford, chairman of Resilience360. David is a frequent keynote at a wide variety of industry events. Some of you may have seen him at Modex just a couple weeks ago. He and his team serve as critical resources to all companies, including many Fortune 500 companies, as they look to manage risk, Peter, as successfully as possible. Welcome in, David.
Thank you, Scott. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Very good. Okay.
So I know you've got some things that you want to share first before we get into the all the Q&A back and forth.
Yeah, very, very good. I think just in a few minutes, just to set up the conversation and to make a few general comments about what we have witnessed in the last few months since we first alerted our clients to what was happening in China back in December, we have been working, with hundreds of companies very closely on this. And I think the first thing that I would say about that is that they're all different. Every company that we've been working with every day is experiencing this outbreak and the impacts of the outbreak in a different way. So in my comments, I'm going to try and address why that is and why that matters, and tease out a few common themes that hopefully will allow you and the audience to have more of a discussion about this. In terms of how they're different, it kind of, to simplify, it comes down to what are you making, where are you making it, and how are you getting it to market. By understanding those broad factors helps us understand why some companies are feeling the pain more than others, and also to understand that, as was said earlier, we're experiencing this both on the supply side and on the demand side. Normally when we see major supply chain disruptions such as Fukushima or the floods in Thailand that we saw the same year, it tends to be more on the supply side where we're seeing supply disruption. What we're seeing here is as much, if not more, demand shocks in different ways around the world. And first phase of this, if you like, was in China, where we were seeing it far more as a supply disruption, and that, as everyone knows, has now moved across the world and is impacting us in different ways. So we'll talk a little bit about the geography and what we've been seeing there. The other major factor is what you make and the way you make it and the complexity of this. So we're seeing in the pharmaceutical industry, as an example, where a huge percentage of the ingredients that go into drug manufacturing are coming out of China. And we saw just this week a complete lockdown in India, which is the leading source of generic drugs for the world, and in turn gets most of the ingredients that go into those generic drugs from China. So depending upon what it is that you make and where you make it, we've seen the timing and the impact on our client supply chains impacted very differently depending upon what it is and where it's being made. The demand side of this is again down to what is it that we're making and selling. And at the top of the stack there is emergency medical supplies that are in huge demand and are not in the right place at the right time. Even the stockpiles that are being put together are not, it looks going to be enough to meet the demand based on most of the projections we're seeing. And then you have consumer essentials where the shelves are empty and there has been a huge demand spike for that. And as was referenced earlier, we expect to see a reaction to that ripple down the supply chain. Factories will crank into action sooner or later, and those products will wash back down the supply chain. No doubt there will be oversupply in some areas, what we think of as the bullwhip effect. But also, if we think about food, people aren't eating more food than they used to, but they're eating it in different places. They're eating it at home. They're buying from grocery stores, not restaurants, and a lot of people are buying that online. So we're starting to see huge shifts, necessary shifts to e-commerce from bricks and mortar, and we'll be watching that carefully to see the extent to which that becomes a permanent shift. We see a combination of Amazon and Walmart hiring 500,000 people to meet that type of demand. Meanwhile, companies in the hospitality and the retail space are closing their doors. When we think about the factors at play here, normally we're looking at things like geopolitical risk and regulatory risk and legal risk and financial risk as the primary causes of supply chain disruptions. In this case, it is the virus that is the primary cause of the disruption, but things like geopolitical and regulatory risk essentially is what is causing the economic fallout based on the necessary reactions that governments are having to take by way of social distancing, lockdowns, quarantines, and the other things that are necessary to stop the rapid spread of the virus. But ultimately, what we're seeing here is really a human risk. Very often we'll see major supply chain disruptions from natural catastrophes, and the factories and the supply chain infrastructure is disrupted, is damaged, is destroyed. In this case, that is not what has happened, but it's the consumer and it is the workforce that is impacted and that is having the knock-on effects. So when we look at where we've got to and what has happened in China and what we see happening next, we could take ocean transportation as an example. The ports generally are open at the moment, but we're keeping a very close eye on ocean. The crews have been on boats for some time. Crew changeovers are coming up. That is going to be a challenge. If crew members themselves get ill, that will be a challenge. Certain countries have started to put quarantine measures in place for any boat that is less than 14 days out of the port of origin. We're starting to see the risk of ports being closed where port workers are infected. Happened briefly in Houston just last week. In Europe, we have issues with equipment, containers being in the wrong place. So things are working okay at the moment in terms of ports, but that's something that we've got a very close eye on. Air transportation, that is a challenge as well, a massive backlog in China. Rates are very high, and with the amount of cancellations of passenger flights and the amount of cargo that gets carried in the bellies of passenger flights, that is having a very significant downward impact on air capacity. And I think the last thing I would say in terms of what we're seeing on different modes, what we saw in China, where even when factories were coming back online, the ground transportation was not able to synchronize with that because of the lockdowns in various different provinces. We're starting to see similar things in the US, where the US states are creating lockdowns, and it is becoming increasingly more difficult for transportation companies to know where they can go and where they can't go. There is risk for the truck drivers themselves. They are, just like the doctors and nurses, on the front lines of the response to this. I'll make a quick call out to the American Logistics Aid Network, ALAN. They are at the center of coordinating, pulling together a single operating picture of what is happening in the US logistics network. So I encourage everyone to reach out to them and see what you can do to help with their effort. So it is fundamentally a human challenge, both the consumer and the workforce, with people on the front lines of this addressing the challenges day in, day out. And one of the biggest challenges we see is information, whether it is summary information for people once a day to get briefings and know what is happening and be able to do that quickly and easily, or to have real-time visibility to the risks and how they're impacting supply chains. So that is our focus, and something that a lot of people are struggling with. So I'll pause there, Scott. A lot of different factors to consider, very complex, tons of uncertainty, and we're thinking very hard about what's going to happen next.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, David. All right, so I'm going to get to some of these comments, and then we've got a couple questions as well. So Derek shares, unfortunately, we find ourselves in a situation where the rational thing to do is to follow the action of the irrational few. Interesting, Derek. Rick is really looking for data integrity to be talked about, as well as making sure teams are staying on top of their invoicing, whether it's digital or manual. Our friend Tevin, who's been on the show with us here, he's with one of the leading transportation providers. Tevin shares that mode optimization for transportation has been thrown out, where express to meet demand will be something more common, especially with this perfect storm of distancing. Reliance on delivery of goods to the doorstep, and very, very low fuel costs. So those three elements are coming together to form that perfect storm. And then So Michael asked David where they can subscribe to the COVID-19 daily update. Michael will make sure that's in the follow-up to all the attendees here. Good information. And then here's the first question I want to pose to you, David, or to the panel, or back to the audience. And this comes from Jessel. Quote, "We have all witnessed the devastating effects of COVID-19 all across the world. Prior to this crisis starting in January 2019, the development of self-driven cars and trucks were really showing good results. Is all of that going to take a back seat now?" Interesting question.
Well, I'll kick this off and let you guys follow on to that. I think there are two things we're seeing. I'll make a general statement around automation, and then I'll speak to autonomous vehicles specifically. So to Greg's earlier point, one of the things that we expect to happen coming out of this over the long term is a faster move towards automation, both in terms of physical automation, robotics, but also in terms of decision making. We think that risk will ultimately become part of every decision that is made in supply chain planning and execution, and that can only happen in an automated sense once that is integrated into existing planning and execution systems. So there's automation that needs to happen both on the physical and the decision-making side. And both of those will accelerate. On the trucking side, we've seen a couple of things. One is that there is more of a sense generally that automation is needed, but in the near term, we're seeing, because so many of these companies are backed by venture capital and private equity, there is a drawback as none of them are profitable, and we've seen one bankruptcy in the last couple of weeks in the autonomous vehicle space, and so cash is going to be a near-term challenge for those companies.
Oh, I didn't even follow my own advice. I was muted. I'm supposed to set the example here. David, appreciate your response. Great question there, Jessel. We're going to keep driving here. So Jeff comments, quote, "First, big thumbs up to David, as certain verticals are laying off people because of the dip in business. Walmart, Amazon, FedEx, UPS, USPS, and the grocery stores are hiring up to 500,000 workers. How do we ensure that we continue to flatten the curve with all this new hiring?" Great question, Jeff. And David, you might not be the perfect person if any of our other panelists would like to weigh in on that question. That's there's no magic wand to flattening the curve, whether it's related to new hiring or other components of the business landscape.
Yeah, well, I think the Amazon Walmart question it's a good one, and it's really an acceleration of a trend that we were already seeing, where there were fewer and fewer retail jobs, but more and more people being employed in distribution centers and fulfillment centers, and this is a temporary but significant acceleration of that, and is likely to be a trend that just continues over the long term. So it is an acceleration, like a lot of these things, where a trend is already moving in a certain direction and gets accelerated by an event like this. But I don't see that reversing over the long term.
Agreed. Beyond the new hiring and how that impacts the challenge of flattening the curve, I've really been concerned, and a lot of folks in our small network here, about just containing it so supply chains can keep moving. I mean, we've seen some of the reporting related to the truck drivers and what some companies are doing to try to mitigate the risk and protect the drivers while protecting the sites. We've seen rest stops go down, a lot of truck stores go down as well, and just to keep things moving while containing the threat is such a challenging environment. All right, so let's move on to so Sandra again weighs in, David, on some of your earlier commentary. She says, Interesting revelation, Dave. I've never thought of the volumes shifting, I guess. The volumes typically traveling air are now shifting and overloading the logistics freight, from some of her clients having to allocate mandatory trips with healthcare commodities. And she says these folks are heroes. So any additional commentary on the shifting you're seeing as it relates to freight, David?
So the shifting is happening in a number of different areas. Certainly the ground transportation moving emergency supplies is a good call out, an important one. We're also seeing a lot of manufacturers retooling their production facilities to increase production around certain goods. These distilleries now making hand sanitizers, and industrial operations making ventilators and respirators. So that is a similar sort of shift that is necessary and very welcome. The intermodal shift is more complicated and is again down to necessity, the availability of capacity, plus the will a production line stop if something doesn't make it there in time? That's going to rise to the top of the air freight list. But there's a lot of goods where the capacity just isn't there to get them to where they need to be on time. The greatest flexibility we have is around truck transportation, and as you say, there's a lot of challenges there, particularly for the drivers. Visibility to what roads and delivery nodes are open and which are closed. So people are having to be very agile and better communicators than they ever have been before.
Great point. And for years, a lot of us have been talking about how we've got to treat our drivers better for the right reasons, but also because of the other, the challenges out in the marketplace and adding drivers to global supply chains. So to our audience, if you've never considered it previously, be extra kind and considerate to the drivers that are doing what they're doing to keep things going. Of course, everyone, medical practitioners, supply chain practitioners, you name it, so many heroes here, but you got to hug on the drivers. Okay, to your point about the air freight capacity, I won't mention who this was, but one of the attendees is with a major transportation provider. They hit 250 flights from China last week, 1 week. So obviously the demand for air freight is huge in certain sectors. Let's see here, trying to figure out what's the most relevant. Let's see, 347, we're right. Let me share one more thing here. This comes from Tevin, one of the transportation providers, and he is speaking to the earlier question, I think, from Jeff about flattening the curve in light of the hiring. So Tevin says, quote, to answer the question from someone asking about flattening the curve, if we hire more people, our entire operation has transformed into work from home for support, warehouse workers being spread out, sanitation stations are everywhere, temperature checking, no questions asked for call-offs, etc. So he's talking about some of the countermeasures in light of the additional labor and human component in their enterprise. Good stuff there. Okay, David, thanks so much for sharing. We're gonna keep on trucking. Sorry, some of the folks we couldn't get to your comments, James and Andrea and Miles. Appreciate you sharing.
Sure.
Thanks so much, David. Okay, so next up, we want to welcome in another special guest, Peter Bolstorff, Executive Vice President with the Association for Supply Chain Management, aka ASCM. You may be also familiar with APIX, which is part of the ASCM family of offerings and organizations. Amongst other things, Peter has co-authored a very successful book entitled Supply Chain Excellence, now in its third edition, I believe, available all around the world. He's certainly a thought leader in the global supply chain community, and we're pleased to have him share and engage with us here. Good afternoon, Peter.
Hey, Scott. Again, welcome everybody. Thanks for this opportunity. Scott, I just want to do a sound check. All good?
You sound great. Yes, sir.
Great. So I'm going to kick it into a different direction, from a little lessons learned here. So today's topic, we wanted to share with the audience the lessons that we've learned from Asia to Europe to the US, how we're helping Africa, India prepare going forward. And so I wanted to share kind of the I'll call it the strategic issues. You know, one of those things, you know, hindsight's always 20/20, but if you could have done something different before, you know, what would we have done differently? So I've got a lot of resources. If you kick it back one slide, Clay, that would be great. Again, ways to stay connected, but there's a couple of resources, specifically that one on the Information is Beautiful. We kind of zeroed in on this probably a week and a half ago. They update every few days, but they have, from a clinical point of view, all of the key figures around the coronavirus, and then how, most importantly, how different countries are attacking it, and then what is the impact of that strategy. And so one of the slides in that deck really talks about what the country has done, and then how has it affected the rate of doubling of cases. So again, a couple of different resources I just want to point out. So if we go to the next slide, for the listening audience, I want to give you my sense of frame. So when we think about a supply chain, we clearly have adopted the SCORE point of view: plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable from your supplier to your customer's customer. And I want to talk a little bit about the SCORE app. It's available Google Play or in the App Store. It's free. One of the metrics under agility is actually value at risk. It was added in SCORE 10.0, I believe, and it really gets at what I would call the science of defining risk. What we see in our corporate clients, and we probably got many in the Fortune 1000, Global 1000, is they use this value at risk as part of their supply planning part of S&OP. That's a whole nother discussion, Scott, so I don't want to focus in on that one. I just wanted to give people, again, resources to address the questions that I see today. So the takeaway from this slide for the listening audience is just think about this as a supply chain as I get into the lessons learned. So if you advance to the next slide. Okay. So this is a lot. So let me kind of break this down for the audience. So one of the things when we work through a transformation program with one of our corporate clients through our transformation learning programs, one of the exercises is to define the supply chain segments. And so let me tell you, and so as we've had lessons learned from Asia, Europe, the US, and now forward preparation for coronavirus or COVID-19 in Africa and India, one of the things that we said is, how do I break the chaos into a more structured view of what kinds of supply chains are we actually dealing with? So let me break this chart down. If we look at the columns, we took the aggregate population of a country, and we broke it down into different types or kinds. So the first or the second column there is this idea around health system workforce. So this would be anybody working in the health system and volunteers. The second major category is the idea around citizens or non-citizens with access to health care. So you've got the general public, you've got diagnosed cases, and then we used, I think it's the WHO categories of diagnosis: mild cases, severe, and critical. The percentages that you see there are the percentages of the cases categorized in that style. So then we move into the second category, major category, and that's citizens or non-citizens without access. So large populations of homeless. As you start getting into, you know, especially the African continent and others, you have large camps of refugees. So you think about it that way. And so again, underneath that, you've got the general population of the population group, and then you've got diagnosed cases, mild, severe, and critical. Again, I just repeated those percentages. So that's how we've broken down the population at large within a country. So now let's talk about the supply chain segments. And so when I say supply chain, I'm talking about the end-to-end supply chain. So every X that you see on this chart would represent, you know, the plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable from supplier to customer's customer. And in this case, the customer's customer is actually the general public or diagnosed case. So every X here is what we would call a supply chain. So the types of supply chain segments that we're learning is you've got this whole idea around education and communication of information to the population groups. And the challenge again is this has been very important, especially those of you in the general public. I know the focus has been on diagnosed cases, but the question that we have is, what's the infection rate? And if you feel like you might be infected, is there something that we can do from a communication standpoint, as opposed to going to the ER or a clinic? So we have seen from a lessons learned standpoint that this is a very important and a critical supply chain of information that needs to be pointed towards different population groups. You've got schools. My wife is a third grade teacher. She and I have both been home together the last couple of weeks. She's teaching 28 kids, third graders, right? So her job has been challenged as well. You've got elder care centers. So how do I plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable that supply chain within both the health system workforce and those that have been diagnosed with severe and critical cases of COVID-19. Then you've got the critical care products, again, that have been frontline and on social media, those masks, sanitizers, ventilators, etc. And again, how do those critical care products then support the health system, workforce, and volunteers? The one big one that again, I'll call it uncovered or discovered or made it very public is this idea around home health. And again, this is something that we may have overlooked in the U.S. How, as a supply chain, how could we have better managed the supply chain of home health? You've got virtual appointments with medical professionals. You've got teleprescriptions. You've got home delivery of different kinds of things. If we would have built up the home health part of this one to handle the general public, how or the mild cases, how might have that gone differently? You've got the whole laboratory, supply chain. So test kits would be one example, but basic supplies around that laboratory supply chain, like swabs that work appropriately. Then there are the obvious ones: the public health, the hospitals, the clinics, the pharmacies. How do we define those supply chains? And then there are ones that you see popping up on photographs, and that's the idea around temporary health, hospitals, clinics, and pharmacies. And I think the other day, Scott, I saw Spain opened up one of their football stadiums as the largest hospital to deal with the pandemic at that time. So, before we turn this over to the listen audience, I just want to make sure everybody understands that we see, again, this template, it's not complete and it can be configured for every country that's going through this, but we see this taking the idea that COVID supply chain issue and then breaking it down, taking that chaos and breaking it down into a very structured way of saying, okay, which COVID-19 supply chain are we talking about and which population group we're talking about. My last point on this one is I've highlighted in green what we think were the big misses. So if you could dial this back, back to, let's just say last August, when, at the US federal level, we were actually going through a simulation around a contagious virus. If we had this chart sitting in front of us and would have asked ourselves the question, how would we define the supply chain? Are we prepared? Are there any risks within the supply chain? What is the capacity of this supply chain? And then what might we do from a risk mitigation standpoint? Again, I think in some of the previous conversations, risk is easy to calculate, but it's hard to implement because, again, at the end of the day, it's costing some money and you're not really sure. It's like an insurance policy. I can most assure you that at least the dialogue that we're having with ministries of health through our foundation and conversations that we're having with chief supply chain officers and state and local governments, that the way we look at risk, as it relates to public health, will be far different, as part of our recovery plan. So if you go to the next and last slide, Clay, again, lessons learned. I think this kind of exercise around supply chain segmentation against population groups helps bring structure to the chaos by, helping profile the number of supply chains, COVID-19, but you could substitute COVID-19 for other risk type events that need to be set up and managed. Again, at least now you have it in a structured way. It also helps group the products and services required for each supply chain to support, and I'll call it the 3 stages of COVID-19: preparedness, response, and then where we're heading right now is into recovery. Because again, as you look at our global challenges, we've got Asia now back on a recovery path, and we're trying to forward prepare Africa and India, from a frontline standpoint. The third takeaway is ultimately defining the customer segment of the population, and making sure we understand what that volume is and the criticality, because that will help prioritize resources. And then the last one is having some kind of an accountable and a responsible role somewhere. Maybe it's that whole idea around public-private, but how do we frame for each supply chain on that risk? How do we supply chain risk mitigation actions and priorities? So the next time, we have in our playbook, in our risk management playbook, we have this at the ready. So again, pretty passionate about this one. A lot to say in a short period of time, but again, Scott, I want to reinforce, we want to hear from the audience. So I'm going to stop talking and kick it back to you, my friend.
Absolutely. Really appreciate it, Peter. So quick, I'm going to step away from the scope of what Peter shared. I want to share a great transportation tip from our friend over at Tom Valentine. Many of you on the call probably know. He wanted to share, quote, LTL carriers are eliminating the performance of inside deliveries at this time. They're also waiving signatures at point of delivery to limit human contact. So Tom suggests taking a picture with your phone to confirm deliveries. Great tip there in these special times, Tom. I hope you're doing well. Always a pleasure to have you. Okay, getting back to Peter, what you were sharing there. Wallace had a question. I want to get you to weigh in, and of course, anyone from our audience. Wallen asks, quote, by driving home the renewed emphasis on systems that introduce new markets and solutions, how can transparency be ensured with the COVID-19 fallout? Interesting question, Wallace. Peter, do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. And again, transparency, is well, there's a lot to that word, right? So one of the things that we found in this COVID-19 response is there would be no way that any one entity, could have prepared and responded to it. It takes public policy, it takes, private enterprise prioritizing production capacity. It takes the consumer, because remember, the consumer, all of us, by the way, are the customer's customer. And if we respect the role that we have in the supply chain, and we do a good job of saying, hey, look, folks, we're heading into this, shelter down, but you can still go get groceries. Don't buy out of pattern. Still support your local restaurants who can do, curbside delivery. I think the consumer has a big part of that one as well. And then of course the last one would be, having somebody accountable for it. So getting back to the question, transparency, I think there's the technical part of the transparency, but I think more importantly, it has to be a public-private collaborative around a risk event that drives it. And then you've got the challenge of state level transparency and then state and federal. I was listening to our governor the other day, and while he was talking, what they thought they had in terms of supply of masks actually just disappeared, because somebody from a federal level, took priority over it. So I'll stop there.
So Scott?
Yes, sir.
Hey, this is Enrique. If I may just say a couple things around that question.
Please.
So it's a very good question to start with, and I'm just going to take it. I'm going to add another level to what Peter just said, and that's just like from a world perspective, right? And the things that we're currently facing, and I'm sure that some of you guys out there are also feeling, is documentation is being forged, US customers don't believe that a facility in China actually exists. There's a lot of different things. Certifications are being forged as well. There's a lot of counterfeits coming into the market because at the end of the day, people are, some of us, I'm hoping the vast majority are trying to help and have a good heart, if you will, kind of like approaching this mess. But some others are also taking advantage of the opportunity, and transparency when it comes to sourcing and shipping from China is right now critical. And some of the things that we're trying to work around to guarantee an expedite delivery of all this very critical products into the U.S. market and the rest of North America.
It's and to our audience, that was Enrique Alvarez, who will be speaking here in just a few minutes, and he's with Vector. They're shipping product all around the world, including we had a request coming over the weekend about from a medical provider. They'd located some medical supplies somewhere in a country outside North America, and they're trying to fight through, customs and find lanes and shipping. And Enrique and as a matter of fact, Bill Stankiewicz, who's also on this webinar, were a couple of the folks that helped out right away on a Sunday. So Enrique, thanks for weighing in. We're gonna Enrique, just a heads up. Your audio kind of went in and out. I know you're a few minutes away from sharing, so for whatever that's worth. Okay, Andrea. Andrea has a question, and Peter, we'll start with you maybe. Andrea says, to follow up what Enrique was saying regarding fraud, as a result, are we going to see an influx of blockchain solutions? Great question. Peter, Enrique?
So, yep, I'm gonna go back to, again, from a strategic standpoint. I think technology, always follows need, right? So I think one of the lessons that we need to figure out from a strategy standpoint is where did we miss from a strategic point of view, again, as it relates to this pandemic and future ones. How do we better integrate risk into our plan, source, make, deliver, return processes? And then thirdly is, how do we start to think about more effective public-private collaborations, especially around these, what I'll call 360 events, where it takes the whole village to kind of work through it, including the consumer. And so I think blockchain is a solution from a technology standpoint. Certainly it has its place, but I'm not sure that blockchain is going to be the silver bullet for how do we handle the next, I'll call it pandemic risk event or other type of risk event.
Yep.
Yeah, just a quick add on blockchain. I think just the reality is that for blockchain to be effective, you need pretty much everyone in the network on the chain, and the data in the blockchain is only as good as the data that is put into it in the first place.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And that's kind of a longly held truth, right? Whether you're talking blockchain or databases or any kind of information systems. Okay, we're about at 4:08, and to our audience, we're going to wrap up today about 4:30. Really appreciate everybody's time. Love all the questions. Quick comment from Sandra. She loves that. What you just said, what David and Peter just shared. Technology, governance, and standards, even cybersecurity, all of them had a foundation of emergency and crisis. Lovely discussion, people. Appreciate that, Sandra. All right, so apologize I couldn't get some of the other comments. Janine, Pierre, Thomas, a few others. We're going to keep on driving here at 4:10. So thanks, Peter. Really appreciate you sharing that helpful framework, the resources, what you're seeing, the takeaways from other countries and their successes or some of their challenges. And everyone, the resources and URLs will be in the decks for each of these speakers. And you can check out more about ASCM at ascm.org beyond the links that Peter shared. Okay, so next up, I want to welcome in another great guest, great partner of ours, Enrique Alvarez, Managing Director of Vector Global Logistics, a provider of logistics services throughout the world. Also, did you know his company was recently recognized for its world-class culture at the 2020 Atlanta Supply Chain Awards? Enrique and his team generously lead a wide variety of humanitarian initiatives globally on top of getting things moved across the world. So welcome again, Enrique.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you to everyone at the audience. Well, I'll dive right into the materials. So I'm going to present a couple of things. One is, as part of our efforts to help the community during this times, we launched a survey in conjunction with Tech Public and a lot of other organizations. They're helping us spread the survey, and I will ask everyone that's listening to do the same. And I have the link on the next slide. The idea is just to gather a little more information about the actual state of our supply chains and some of the main concerns and expectations of the people that are just going through this very unique challenge for us all. And with that said, let me just explain a little bit of the different things that we saw. The survey is not closed yet, and this is just a very small segment of all the different responses that we've had. It's going to take a little bit longer to compile everything and put it in writing, and then we'll share it with everyone. We'll post this openly so that everyone can not only see it and read it, but then also maybe add to it, trying to make sure that we come together and we work with each other, because I believe that's going to be the only way to minimize this difficult situation. So in terms of like things that are people, how are they feeling, people that are really struggling, and everyone else included, uncertainty is the first thing that comes to everyone's mind. How long will this last? And there's like different answers to that question, which by now should probably be somewhat not easy, because none of this is easy, and it's affecting different communities and different countries in different ways. But we still don't know if it's going to take the 20 days, the 6 months, is it longer? How serious is it really? Is it just affecting certain types of the population? So people are out there are still kind of not sure what we are facing. Everyone sees and can feel the big economic impact that this is having in our economy, but then also around the world. The other thing that as business owners and suppliers and clients are trying to grasp the velocity of everything that's going on. So there's been just too many changes, and it's just too quickly. And I've had really good conversations with different people, and it ranges from the very, very basic tools that are, well, not everyone in my team has a company cell phone. How can they work remotely if they don't have laptops? We cannot have everyone dial into the VPN at the same time. We can't really share this online because it's important information. So it goes from like the how are we going to just conduct our jobs to, well, there's major manufacturing disruptions, there's complete business shutdowns. Like there's a lot of industries out there that are suffering the backlash of this event. And some of the things are just the decrease in demand, which is very real for a lot of industries. Some of their staff being infected, and yes, they would love to kind of like keep going and try to put a good fight, but if your team's actually struggling to be healthy, then there's really nothing more important than that. They're worried about the travel restrictions and just the border closings as well. The other big category that I could highlight from our findings is just poor communication, and I think David and Peter have both kind of mentioned this as well. It's just there's just too much content, too many media outlets. There's not a lot of filters. It's not very specific for some industries. There's not like one official channel to share information among supply chain owners that's kind of worldwide recognized. And so a lot of people are feeling overwhelmed. At least I know I do, and I'll just speaking for myself and my family, like all the people at our homes having access to social media and WeChat and WhatsApp and texting. I mean, it has gone, and I'm talking about my personal experience, but it just has gone exponentially. You can't control it. It's just too much. So those are the main things, and that's how people are feeling. So I wanted to stop here and then just see. I know that the Q&A session's at the last part of the presentation, but I wanted just to get a sense from everyone that's listening about how you're feeling, because I feel like acknowledging the way we're feeling is very important to then push forward. And of course, after that, I can continue presenting what I have.
Okay, so let's do this. So to give you a quick survey to our audience on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 where dire set of circumstances, and 10 is where you're one of the few folks that are just, I guess, having a great week. Shoot me a quick number on that scale on the comments, and we'll just get a quick pulse. How about that, Enrique?
Okay. That's a great idea, Scott. Thank you for jumping in.
You bet. All right, so we've got
I'm sure that it will stay on time.
Yeah, and we'll figure standard deviation too.
Scott,
yes,
this
sir.
is Peter.
Hey.
Yep. So I would add for everybody which major geography you're in, because I want to raise the issue that Asia is in a different place than Africa, India, the US, and Europe. So it'd be interesting to segment that way. So let me throw that out there as well.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And we've got someone that is, I'm going to read off these in a second. I'm going to see who has their hand up.
While people are responding to that, maybe put me back to the previous slide and I'll talk over the charts. Awesome. So sourcing from and shipping from China, it's just going to be a key component to minimizing the overall impact. And we just need to come together now in order for that to happen. It's not a secret that our economy in many ways still relies on manufacturing from China, and they're trying to help. I have really good partners, and I've been communicating with them for the last couple of weeks, every night, I guess our night, their day, and they're willing to help. They're willing to be there for us, and they're doing everything they can to actually go back to producing and sending and shipping and just being good partners. So that's definitely good to note, because we're not alone in this, and I think we have really good partners around the world.
Great point.
So a couple of questions from the survey. How many months of supply do you have in your supply chain? And 18% said it was less than a month. 9 is 1 month. 46. So you'll get the picture. Like, everyone is kind of going to struggle, and with everything that we have heard from Peter and also David, the supply chains are pretty stressed already. Capacity is incredibly tight, and so that will kind of compound the effect that this is having. And then the other thing that I'll read for you, because I feel like it's too small font, but what part of the supply chain most concerns you was one of the other questions. And the first bar is air carriers. Second one is distribution centers, the ports, and the ports are leading. And again, as David mentioned, like the Houston port closed a couple of terminals on Friday. They reopened them after a couple of weeks, after a couple hours. But that's one of the main concerns that people out there are having, and I think it is reflective of what we're seeing. Quarantining vessels, getting port employees or workers sick, and things like that are just going to even make this problem a bit just more challenging. Last mile delivery is the next bar. Manufacturing, ocean shipping, trucking, and just the workforce in general. So clearly people think that the ports and distribution centers are the two things in our supply chains that are the most critical aspects of what we have right now. Clay, if you don't mind going to the next one. Another question is, how do you expect your volumes to change in the next 6 months, right? And so, again, it's not very optimistic. 30% says they might drop, 40% or more. 10% is 20 and 30. The last question is, well, what can we learn, or what kind of wins you guys have over the last few weeks, because at the end of the day, I think that we're getting a very good sense of what the problem is and how bad it's going to impact us. And I think that it will probably be about time for everyone to start shifting towards, okay, now what are we doing that's working? And let's just keep cheering each other up a bit as well. So these are some quotes from people that have responded to the survey, and just the first one is collaboration with competitors and support from teammates. And they felt that they actually have a more fair and honest competition with their rivals, quote unquote, which I think it's a good thing. Working together with food and pharmaceutical industries to find ways to provide pallets. So they're just collaboration is one. Some other clients, they're seeing a spike in their online sales, which is a good thing for those industries. And some people are also happy about insurance and some of this other, I guess, support and aid that the government's offering, like small business loans and not having to pay the rent for their office or warehouses for a month, rent deferrals and things like that are also happening, and people are grateful for. And so that's kind of my presentation today. I would like to hear it from the audience, and of course, field any questions that you might possibly have.
Wonderful. So let me give a quick summary of some of the check-ins that we got. Tom, you've had your hand up for 12 minutes and somehow I've missed it. So I'm going to get to you in just a second. But Enrique, to your question, most of the median is probably either 6 or 7 on a scale of 10. Let me read a couple of these. Jeff is dialed in from New York metro area, so we all know the situation there. Sandra says 7, simply because she's an eternal optimist. On the flip side, Sandra also is unable to cross some of the borders to see her family, so very challenging there. Peter is also in the New York metro area. Jody says we're on a 5. We're a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10 in the U.S. in terms of our level of concern. We are in the hardware space, and so far our demand is solid in home improvement. Also want to, our friend Bo Groover is here. Bo has been very active helping provide training opportunities with the market during these challenging times, amongst other things. But Bo shares the following, quote, "Hey Scott, anecdotally, the first case in China was December 19th, and most people think they are out. They're out of the most of it, barring some weird thing, or 90 days. The first U.S. case was January 26th, so we're about 60 days in, provided people practice physical distancing." Good use of that term, Bo. "We should be nearing the pinnacle, again, if there is, in fact, a pattern." Good stuff there. One more comment from Janine. "One of the disruptions occurring within the U.S. school systems and learning environments. This has highlighted the digital divide that exists in vast areas of the U.S. So the question Janine has, and we'll pose this to you, Enrique, what supply chain tools or methodologies can we implement to ensure fast, efficient distribution of computers, laptops, etc., to the students and teachers to ensure this digital divide is addressed?" Enrique.
Well, that's a great question, and I have 2 kids myself, and it is interesting to see how they're shifting the schooling to online tools, and that's something that's definitely going to be a good learning experience for everyone as we come out of this crisis. In terms of how to expedite delivery of some of these computers and technology, it's really just relying on the supply chains that we currently have. Companies like DHL, companies like FedEx, all those different companies that are currently helping distribute products and packages and small parcel, they're still working. They're still working hard. Their drivers are amazing. And I know that you've said this before, Scott, but I would totally support like just having a campaign to really give credit to all those drivers out there that are still risking their health. I mean, I wouldn't just trying to distribute. So I think that would be my answer. There's really nothing new that's coming up in the in the fight to resolve this. It's really just relying on people and the relationships we have with them and the companies to make sure that those packages are still delivered and those computers are still delivered.
Great point. Okay, great question. Tough question. The answer will probably continue to evolve here. Hey, Bill Stankiewicz, if you're on, you left me a great voicemail earlier this week, kind of a in a nutshell update on some of the things at the ports. I'd love to recognize you here just quickly if we can. I'm going to take you off mute. Bill, can you hear us? Okay, Bill. All right, we'll see. Took a chance, and we'll figure out the raise your hand play. One more comment as we look to close up here. This came from Fernando. Quote, all companies ought to have contingency plans for earthquakes, floods, etc. that will disrupt our normal way we do business. Preparedness to work remotely and or for business continuity helped his company to be ready to continue our operations running for the last 2 weeks. Of course, different industries may need different solutions on contingency planning. Good stuff there. Okay, well, as much as I hate to wrap up here, I know we've taken so much time from everyone. I really appreciate all of our speakers and the time they've taken and the insights they've shared to our audience, as we couldn't get to everybody, and I knew that would happen. I appreciate all the sentiment you shared and the questions and how engaged you've been. Really want to thank, as we look to adjourn today's program, I want to thank our sponsor once again, EFT by Reuters Events. Really appreciate all of their valuable contributions to moving industry forward. Okay, thanks to everyone. Huge thanks to our presenters, or each of our attendees for collaborating with us here on Supply Chain Now this afternoon. We're grateful to have you all join us and really lean into the discussions we've had. To our audience, most importantly, we wish you all the success in the world as you navigate, as we all navigate this challenging time. Stay safe. Best wishes for you and your families. On a much lesser note, you can find all of our programming at supplychainnowradio.com. Of course, you can find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. On behalf of the entire team here, the panel, the A+ panel that was assembled, the attendees that weighed in with some really sharp insights. By the way, Greg White, I almost forgot. Greg mentions that for all the comments and questions we couldn't get to, stay tuned because we're going to try to address them on platforms like LinkedIn in the coming hours and days. So maybe we can engage there. But on behalf of the entire team, Greg and Clay and Amanda, you name it, Scott Luton here wishing you successful days and weeks ahead. Follow the expert advice and precautions. Don't panic. Brighter days lie ahead. This too shall pass, and we'll see you next time on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.